Hello, everyone. I'm Blake Tedder, the Communications Engagement Coordinator with the Duke Forest Teaching and Research Lab at Duke University. This is another video in our new series from the Office of the Duke Forest called Ask a Scientist. Our goal is to engage our community with science and introduce you to some of our researchers. The questions we will ask our scientists are for non-scientists, submitted by you, non-scientists, and asked by me, a true non-scientist. I hope this conversation will be interesting to you, and you can find out more about the Duke Forest at dukeforest.duke.edu or by signing up for our newsletter or following us on social media. Okay, today we are very excited to have Dr. Charles Mitchell. He's a researcher and professor in the Department of Biology at the University of North Carolina. His research group investigates the community ecology of infectious disease. They study pathogens infecting wild plants, chiefly grasses, and their main current interest is interactions between fungal pathogens and the broader leaf microbiome. He received his PhD in 2001 from the University of Minnesota and has been associated with UNC Biology for the better part of 15 years. He currently has ongoing research in the Duke Forest, where he literally watches the grass grow, and we're excited to have him on this series, and we'd love to ask him about his research. So welcome, Charles. Glad to have you here.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So in these interviews, we typically ask a few standard questions, and then we get into questions that were submitted by some of our users. So the first standard question is, what do you study generally, and what's exciting about it to you?
So I study how epidemics are influenced by interactions among multiple species of biological organisms. So I study epidemics of pathogens, and that's when a pathogen infects an increasing number of host individuals in a host population. And, species of all kinds get epidemics, not just humans. And so it's already an interaction between two different biological species, the host species and the pathogen species. And what I'm really interested in is interactions that go beyond those two, to include things like competitors of the host species and multiple species of pathogens that might interact within a host, and other microbes that might exist within a host that interact with the pathogens.
Okay, and just for the benefit of me and the other non-scientists out there, what are pathogens generally, and what are the kind of broad categories of pathogens? And do you study all of them?
Well, I am broadly interested in all of them. I do focus on the ones that are in plant leaves currently, but in general, a pathogen is and pathogen and parasites are closely, essentially the same thing. Basically, they're organisms or viruses that extract their living from other host organisms and do so in a continuous manner. So they have a intimate association with the host. So the pathogen is residing in or on a host individual and extracting resources and causing disease ultimately.
Okay, and so while I was at Carolina, which is where I went to undergrad, I was, by your definition, a pathogen on my parents. I was extracting resources from them the entire time. I was
Oh,
very
well,
lucky to do.
right. Well, I said that's a key distinction, which is the causing disease component of that. I didn't add that to the end there, but yes, but that actually does highlight that among microbes, there are many species that cause disease under some circumstances and not under others, depending on things like environmental conditions. So something that's a pathogen in one place and time may not be a pathogen in a different place and time. Yeah, back to parents and offspring.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure
yeah,
the parents would say you had a net benefit.
yeah, it was, and I'm very grateful. What's exciting about that to you? Why would you study that?
Right. Well, I find pathogens to be generally fascinating organisms, but it's an especially exciting, if distressing, time right now
Mm.
with the COVID-19 epidemic, because a pathogen epidemic is in the news every night and it's on people's minds. And
Mm.
in this case, it's obviously sad and distressing and frustrating, but it does highlight the importance of pathogens. And what we try to do in our research is to uncover general principles that have the potential to apply across a wide range of pathogens. So we study those in plant leaves, but we try to understand principles that can apply to pathogens infecting humans and other animals as well.
Okay, yeah. So it's far-reaching effects. So how do you study that generally? I know you work on grass mainly and studied how pathogens proliferate through grass, but how would one study that? Do you just look at it, grass, and see what's going on it, or is there, tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, we use a variety of tools. Our biggest, sort of what I think of as my core scientific approach is conducting experiments in the field. And that is one of the main things I do at Duke Forest. And main reason I work there is that we can conduct experiments where we either manipulate the plant community in general or manipulate our particular host species or manipulate the pathogens or the microbes that are involved and then see how different pathogen epidemics respond to those manipulations. We also do just observational surveys in the field as well. And so those are also done chiefly at Duke Forest. And so, yes, in those cases, we're just looking at leaves and observing and tracking pathogen infections without manipulating the system.
Okay.
And at that point, it's worth mentioning that the pathogens we're currently focused on are ones that can be seen for most of their life cycle with the naked eye. They're producing lesions on plant leaves that are
Mm.
visible, and so we can quantify them and observe them in a way that's non-destructive, although we do some other things where we collect tissue for lab analyses.
Sure.
And then finally, like most scientists, we also do work in the lab as well. Some experiments in the lab and some things are just like quantifying the chemical composition of plants and things like that.
Okay, great, thank you. And um, where in the Duke Forest generally are you? I'm asking, I know, but to share with other folks.
Yeah, we work at Widener Farm, which is off of Mount Sinai Road, and we share the site not only with other researchers but also with the Duke campus farm
Mhm.
that produces produce for the Duke campus.
Great, great. And why is your research, you mentioned a little bit of this earlier, but why is your research important to the field and to the general public, to the field and the many fields that it is involved in?
Yeah, I think the biggest reason is trying to understand these fundamental principles of pathogen transmission. So things that determine when a pathogen will be transmitted more in a host population and be more likely to have an epidemic. And so that's of fundamental interest and also important for many species, including human health. Our work also does have an agricultural dimension on it since we're working on plants and uh, as we may talk about more, tall fescue is an agricultural plant. So there is also that dimension to it as well.
Okay, and I just heard you mention tall fescue. Is that the only plant you study? Well, I know that's a big part of what you study, but are there others? Is that your focus?
That is my current focus. Over the years, and including at Duke Forest, we've studied a whole diversity of plants, including interactions among many different plant species. Um, we have at Duke Forest always done that in the herbaceous communities, so the open fields and meadows of Duke Forest, and but right now I'm focusing on that one species in particular, the grass species tall fescue, because we found, based on prior research, that it holds a rich diversity of microbes, specifically fungi in the plant leaves, also other microbes, bacteria too. But um, it hosts several species of fungal pathogens that can have simultaneous epidemics or really more sequential epidemics over time, but within the same season. And that also has well-known mutualistic fungi in the leaves as well. So we're trying to understand interactions between these multiple species of pathogens and mutualistic fungi and other microbes. And ultimately, we plan to widen the scope back out to include other plant species as well. But right now, we're mostly focused on that one.
Okay, thank you. And so we'll transition into some of the questions from some of our newsletter recipients. And the one that I'm sort of leaning to right now, because you were just talking about fescue and in the fields and meadows of Duke Forest, which, by the way, some people don't realize we have multiple sort of types of land bases in the Duke Forest that can be used for different types of research purposes. So it's nice to talk to someone who uses the meadows and fields for their research. One of the questions we got was, are the same diseases you see in fescue in the wild, quote unquote, the same ones we see in our yard? So when you talk about fungal pathogens that you're seeing in that field, are they the same ones we're seeing in our yard and that we're treating with all sorts of fungicides and things like that?
Yes, in fact, they are. So yeah, fescue is an interesting plant in that it has various ecological roles, as well as being widely planted in people's yards. It also is the dominant species in livestock pastures and hayfields around the state and region. And it also is just a dominant plant species in grass-dominated habitats across the region that aren't necessarily directly managed by people. So it's both an agricultural plant and a wild plant simultaneously. It sort of straddles a diversity of habitats. And back to the pathogens, which you asked about, yes, the one we're studying are ones that would be in people's lawns as well. There's one in particular that we study. The disease it causes is called brown patch, and it can be quite a substantial pest in lawns. Each time around this time of year, I haven't seen it yet, but when I drive by the local lawn center, they often have a sign out front saying, "Protect your lawn against brown patch now," and
Hmm.
that's one of the ones we study.
I just picked my head out and I don't have it yet, but I will. I'm
Oh,
sure.
yes.
Yeah. So is this is my personal question. Is fescue native to North Carolina, or is maybe that's not even the right question. Is it naturally occurring here, or has it jumped from yards and agriculture into the population?
So tall fescue is native to Europe and Asia, so it's not
Uh,
native to North America. It was introduced in the later 1800s. Forget precisely, but sometime in the second half of the 1800s.
okay.
And but it's extremely widespread across the Mid-Atlantic states and also many other parts of the country as well. It's even out on the West Coast.
Got it. Okay. Um, what or where have you studied, and what types of other things have you studied besides grasses? I assume they're thinking of other organisms that you may have studied uh, your pathogen approach with.
Yeah, so well, as you mentioned, I did my PhD in Minnesota, so that was my starting point was the prairies of Minnesota and their grass-dominated habitats dominated by native grass species up there in those prairies. And then before really focusing my work in Duke Forest, I worked for a number of years while at UNC, but I did my field work mostly in California grasslands in Northern California, also focused on grasses out there. Um, but in yeah, in various parts of my work, I have worked not only on the grasses in a strict sense, but other types of plants that interact and potentially compete with grasses, so wildflowers, some trees that establish in the fields, things like that. So I am mostly focused on the grasses, but I have done some work on other plants as well.
Okay, well, great. So then there's a follow-up question that someone asked is what made Dr. Mitchell want to study grass? And I'm thinking if you could take us, this is sort of to help people think about what's in the mind of a scientist who dedicates their life to research of one thing for their career. When was the moment that you realized you wanted to study grass? Was it when you were a kid laying in a field somewhere, or was it you had a certain lab that you were involved in at Minnesota? Take us to that sort of decision point.
Yeah, it was really when I started my graduate work at Minnesota, and a reason I went there. And so there's really two major reasons. And so the first one is that grasses are an a study system that is tractable to experiments. So we can do, because they grow relatively quickly and are relatively small compared to the trees that comprise the more familiar
Mm,
organisms of Duke Forest, we can do an experiment on like a couple meters squared over a couple years that to do with a similar number and like lifespan of, relatively speaking, of trees would take like half of Duke Forest.
that,
Um,
mhm.
so
That
that's
makes tons of sense. Yeah.
that's the first reason we can do experiments on small scales. The other reason is just the fundamental importance of grasses. Like plants in general, I mean, they're the base of the food web. So
Mm,
anything that impacts grasses can potentially impact the rest of the food web. So pathogen impacts on grasses might impact animals that feed on grasses, things like that.
mm,
And grasses in particular, we don't usually use the term quite this way, but if people stop and think about it, most of our food is derived from grasses. In fact,
mm,
corn, wheat, those are themselves grasses. We just
mm.
don't usually use that word for them, but biologically, evolutionarily, they're grasses. And then our animals that we depend on for food, they're mainly eating grasses and grains
Yeah,
produced by the grasses.
sure. Are my question follow up there are diseases or pathogens that are found in grasses, do they transfer into mammals that eat them? Or and is that part of the agricultural impact of your studies?
That's an excellent question, and no, that they don't.
Oh,
Um, which is important. There are, you do hear, for example, about foodborne illnesses of humans from like leafy vegetables and things like romaine lettuce like has had problems the last few years. There's been recalls, but it's important that um, those microbes people are getting sick from on the romaine lettuce, those aren't actually pathogens of romaine lettuce. Those are basically contaminants
mm,
of things that just infect animals. They're not doing anything at all to the lettuce except for sitting on the outside of the lettuce. They're not really part of the lettuce.
okay. And as we're talking about uh, animals digesting these plants, there's this great question of, I think it was a great question, I don't know. I see mention on your site about the microbiome in plants. How is this similar to the gut microbiome that we're hearing about so much these days? Does that make
Yeah,
sense to you?
yes, that's a great question.
Oh, good.
And well, I mean, all the questions are really excellent ones, but yes, the so there so a similarity is that every species on Earth that isn't itself a microbe is packed full of microbes, and
Mm,
so the gut sort of exemplifies that for humans. Humans also have microbiomes on the surface of our skin and lots of other tissues, and plant leaves and plant roots, for that matter, are also full of different species of microbes.
oh,
The one difference, though, is that in humans, the gut microbiome is overwhelmingly bacteria, And plants certainly also have diverse bacteria infecting their tissues, but in humans, fungi are pretty rare and less diverse and less common in humans, at least in the gut. Whereas in plants, have a lot of fungi, and they tend to be very diverse in their tissues. And that goes back to when plants first merged onto land. I mean, they've associated with fungi both as mutualists and pathogens and commensals, like going back to the first land plants. And so that's one big difference, is that it's fungi are more important compared to humans and other animals.
And a perfect follow-up question that someone asked to that is, do grasses get viruses? I know viruses are in the animal and insect worlds. Are they also in the plant world?
Yes, they do. Everything gets viruses. Even bacteria get viruses, and
Oh,
fungi get viruses, and arguably there are even viruses of viruses. Although that gets to be a little
yeah, yeah.
philosophical, a little meta. But the yeah, and in fact, I spent about 15 years of my career mostly focused on viruses. I did my PhD
Oh,
on
wow.
fungi, and I've moved back to fungi, but I worked for quite a while on viruses.
Ah, well, definitely learning a lot new here. There was a question about community ecology, and they said, well, what is it, and how is that different from regular ecology? And are there community ecology approaches to other diseases, like in humans and the coronavirus? And I'm assuming this person got this from your website, reading about community ecology, and I know that that's sort of an approach of yours. So if you could sort of describe that, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, there's kind of a series of questions there, so I'll try to unpack it a little bit. So, for starters, maybe it's good to ask, what is ecology? So,
Mm,
yeah, a common definition of ecology is the study of interactions between organisms and their environment. And the environment for an organism includes not only the physical environment, so things like temperature and you know uh, physical conditions, but also other living organisms in the environment. And then community ecology is the study of interactions between diverse groups of living organisms living in an area or a habitat together.
mm,
So, for example, people study the community ecology of understory herbs in Duke Forest, and
mm,
their interactions and diversity. And and so that does apply to pathogens and parasites. And so, an important thing that most folks don't realize is that most species of pathogens and parasites can infect, and commonly do infect, multiple species of host organisms. And this is true even for those that infect humans, although we don't usually appreciate it, that approximately 70% of known pathogens and parasites of humans also infect non-human animals.
mm,
And so this sets up the potential for interactions among diverse species, and suggests that taking a community ecology approach to, which basically means trying to understand those interactions among diverse species, and can be relevant. And one of the study systems, one of the or pathogen systems that has been best studied and applied to is that of Lyme disease, which people have probably heard of. We do have it in North Carolina, although it's much more prevalent in the northeastern U.S. and the midwestern U.S. And as people may know, it's transmitted. It's a bacterium that's transmitted to humans by ticks. And where the ticks get the Lyme disease pathogen is from non-human animals. Chiefly, the white-footed mouse is like one of the main reservoir hosts. Um, so where the community ecology comes in is that it's pretty clear, first of all, that a major contributing factor to the emergence and spread of Lyme disease in human populations has been our fragmentation of the eastern forest and breaking that up into small parcels of land. And more specifically, that has led to changes in the communities of mammals that infect those forest patches. So, for example, we have, we've lost predators. We have lots more deer than we used to have. And interestingly, it also seems that there are more white-footed mice than we used to have, or at least they're the one thing that is really common across a wide range of forest patches across the eastern U.S. And that has been fingered as a key contributor to the transmission to humans. And so people are studying things like how competition with other small mammals might impact transmission from this so-called reservoir host species, how interactions with predator species that prey on mice might interact and influence transmission, how the masting of acorns that mice feed on can influence their populations. All these interactions among all the diversity of species in eastern deciduous forests. And that's probably the best studied system. As to coronavirus, people are starting to apply these approaches. It's in the very infancy, since of course that only emerged in the past year, and Lyme disease emerged over 30 years ago. But it is pretty well established that the natural host for the coronavirus that's circulating now is bats in China. And it may likely infect multiple species of bats, and those bats may interact with other diverse species. And so, people are interested to try to understand how those interactions might, regulate transmission of the virus in bat species. And also, it's presumed that there were some other species that might have been sort of a bridge host between bats and humans. And so that could be another role for community ecology there, another species getting involved.
So it's really sounds like types of systems thinking, and maybe we shouldn't blame ticks wholly for their role in spreading Lyme disease, even though they're terrible creatures, but they clearly serve some purpose. So that was my own judgment. But one of the things I heard you saying is that there are human causes in that system that may be making the disease, flourish even more. So that's very interesting.
Yes.
And so presumably too in the coronavirus, there may be, I think it's pretty clear that there are community human caused human factors that are playing into it. Okay. So I've got two more questions, and we're right at the end of our time. Let's see, which one do I want to ask? Oh, this is a really good one. Back to someone's yard, and which I think is a lot of the way we think about grass. Is a lot of us think about what's in our yard. How do diseases spread through grass? I think they're asking about sort of the mechanism of that. I see spots all over my yard in different places. Are those connected? Or are those separate outbreaks?
Yeah, good question. So different diseases spread different ways. A lot of, the majority of fungi producing disease in plant leaves spread between leaves and between plants by spores. And so those spores, in many cases, are released into the wind and spread on the wind, potentially for long distances. Other ones tend to be splashed around by rain or perhaps by sprinklers. So that can also move them around on kind of a smaller distance. And then there are some that spread through the soil. So that brown patch one that I mentioned, it can be spread between plant leaves, but also exist naturally in the soil and can spread through the soil. So I would say that yes,
All of the
definitely.
above.
Yeah, but and then the different patches that you see in your yard probably are connected in some way, but yeah, they might how they're connected might depend on the specific cause of that patch they're seeing.
Sure. Yeah. So it sounds like there's a number of diseases and they can spread in a number of different ways. And the Sisyphean effort of dealing with our yard goes on forever. So, anyways, that's my own personal take on that. The last question, and thank you so much for your time, is a cute one. Does your back ever hurt looking at grass all the time?
Yes, it does. That is sort of an occupational hazard because, yeah, we're sort of spend a lot of our lives stooped over, sometimes with a magnifying glass, even, yeah, looking at small parts of plants close up. So,
I would bet
um,
so.
yes, we have to be try to take it easy on ourselves and like get up and do an occasional stretch.
Sure. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being taking this time to be with us. And if people want to find out more about your work or about you, how can they do that?
Right. So one way is starting this fall, tentatively in October, there'll be an exhibit at UNC's Moorhead Planetarium and Science Center based on
Cool.
our work in Duke Forest that I've just been talking about. So they're currently basically assembling that, and we're very excited about that. It'll be open to the public, and and that'll be going on for several years. It'll be open actually, so that should be around for people to see long term.
That's wonderful. Cool. I mean, I can't wait to hear about that. And I hope it does go forward with, with all the contingencies that are in place right now. That would be wonderful. So thank you so
Yes.
much. Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you out there for watching. This has been another video in our series called Ask a Scientist. If you learned something from this video, let us know about it in the comments below and stay tuned to what we're doing at the Duke Forest Teaching and Research Laboratory by signing up for our newsletter and following us on social media. Have a nice day and may the forest be with you.